so that we please recite the Surah Al-Fatiha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صلوا على محمد وعلى آله. Another second louder salawat. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وبه نستعين. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على الخلق أجمعين. اللهم صل على محمد. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني زيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. أما بعد فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. إنما وليكم الله ورسوله والذين آمنوا الذين يقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة وهم راكعون ومن يتولى الله ورسوله والذين آمنوا فإن حزب الله هم الغالبون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلى على محمد وعلى آله. Dear brothers, if I can have everybody move a little bit forward so that we can have more space for those who are entering, inshallah. أحسنتم. صلوا على محمد وعلى Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In these past few nights, we have been talking about Wilayat as a central theme in the Quran and in the teachings of the Ahlulbayt. And in the beginning, we talked about our definition for Wilayat as a very close and intimate relationship, one of authority, but also of love, one of obedience, but also of compassion and of mercy and of care. And then we mentioned that Allah, first and foremost, as the Quran, Allah is ultimately Ali, and all of the other connections and relationships that we have with the rest of His creation ultimately are supposed to bring us back to Allah, to fortify and strengthen that relationship we have with Allah. All of the people that surround us, all of the blessings that God has given us, the life, the food, the drink, the breath that we take in and that we let out. All of these things are means and instruments and tools that we are supposed to use to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But as we mentioned, according to the teachings of the Ahlulbayt, that the second form of wilayah, our second wali that Allah mentions in this ayah of Surah Al-Ma'idah, إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ. That's the Prophet of Allah, Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. Is our wali as well. And this is where the wilayah of the Prophet becomes very clear when we look in the Quran itself. النبي أولى بالمؤمنين من أنفسهم. That the Prophet has more authority and is closer in terms of his relationship to the believers than they are to themselves. And the believers, in other words, they love themselves, but their love for the Prophet should overcome and be stronger than their love for themselves. If my mind or my heart tells me to do something, but then the Prophet tells me to do something else, then I should listen and obey the Prophet of Allah. Last night I mentioned this ayah of Surah Ar-Rum, and it wasn't quite clear when there was a question about how do we reconcile and make sense of this ayah when we talk about the relationship that we have to the Prophet. Allah says in Surah Ar-Rum, فَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا لَا تَبْدِيلَ لِخَلْقِ اللَّهِ ذَلِكَ الدِّينُ الْقَيِّمُ وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Allah says, turn your face towards the religion and the obedience and the deen, the piety and the worship of God as a Hanif. This is the fitrah, the creation that God has created all human beings upon. There is no change in the creation of Allah. And that is the true religion. That is the established and upstanding religion that God has called all humans to. وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Yet most people do not know. They do not understand. This verse, it tells us that Allah has created us based on a very specific creation. And He has placed within us a very basic understanding of what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false. So if we see, for example, someone is oppressing another person, doing some sort of injustice, and we witness that, our fitrah, our very nature as a human being, tells us that this is wrong. And if I have the ability to, I should stop that oppression and that person who is being unjust. In another moment, when a person does me kindness, they have raised me, they have given me all of the things that I have, or even just something small. He brings me a cup of chai. And right before this, you all had chai, the very tasty and delicious chai that the brother brought. What is my response? It should be to say thank you. I should do tashakkur or shuk. This is a very common thing that we have in all of our different cultures. If I were to respond to that kindness of the brother by saying, this chai is not really good, and you should just take it back. And I, for example, spill it on the ground, or I throw it at the wall. I'm disrespectful. First of all, if somebody is witnessing that, if somebody is looking on, they would say, what a terrible human being. Right? Not only is he not being grateful for the blessing that he has, but he is showing that ingratitude. And that ingratitude is something that we, as human beings, very basic level reject. This golden rule that we talk about, do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. This is a very basic principle that each human being understands, and this is an understanding that Allah has placed in our nature. That we can only accept so much evil before our natures and our conscience and our intellects, they call out. And they say we are going to reject this. But then, as I mentioned last night, the Quran tells us at the same time, and the teachings of the Ahlulbayt tell us, that our intellects are limited. And rather, the story of Islam and the story of the religion of God, rather the story of creation, is not based on how much I understand of Allah's creation, but it revolves around the Prophet of Allah. It revolves around his understanding. How much what he knows to be good and what he knows to be evil. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Before talking about this discussion for tonight, I'd like to just mention, when I said last night that the story of the creation of Allah revolves around the story of Allah's relationship to His Prophet. This is a very basic teaching of the Ahlulbayt, and it has many different angles and many different effects on how we look at not just religion, but as well how we look at ourselves. A lot of times these days, in our culture, in our society, people talk about telling my story, about telling what I want and what I need. But if we think about my creation as a part of the story of the creation of the Prophet, that I am created to be guided by the Prophet. Allah wanted for the Prophet to reach his ultimate potential, and then He created me as a creature for me to listen to the Prophet, so that the Prophet can increase in thawab and in his rank, and Allah can shower the prophets with more mercy. Then my goal in life should not about telling my story, or about telling and about expressing my place in this world, but rather it should be about me telling where does my life fit in the life of the Prophet. The Prophet becomes the center of my life. I do not become the center anymore. This makes us into people who are devoted and sacrifice ourselves for the Prophet of Allah. We try to become like the Prophet and like his Ahlulbayt. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala. So these points that we mention on these nights, inshallah, we can reflect on them. Each one of them might open up another aspect of our religion and our tradition, because these are all derived from the hadith of the Ahlulbayt and the understanding of the ulama that they give us of these ahadith. So we can spend these nights and these days reflecting on some of these ahadith and these ayat. But let's go back to the conversation. On the one hand, Allah, and in particular the Ahlulbayt, they tell us that our intellects are one of the greatest ways that Allah guides us to Himself. And then on the other, the Prophet is given priority in terms of that guidance as well. There is a very beautiful aspect that is really unparalleled in the teachings of the Ahlulbayt, that they focus on the aql. You don't find this in other schools in Islam. How much the Ahlulbayt focus on the aql, on the intellect, and the human beings' very ability to understand Allah's creation and as well Allah's religion. The intellect. Sometimes we consider it the reason or reasoning, but let us use the Arabic word al-aql. There's a very beautiful hadith of our fifth Imam, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam. Where the Imam says to one of his companions, لَمَّا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ الْعَقْلِ اسْتَنْطَقَهُ ثُمَّ قَالَ لَهُ أَقْبِلْ فَأَقْبَلَ. When Allah created the intellect, the aql, He lets that aql, that intellect speak. And He told the intellect, come forward. And the aql came forward. And He told it to go back, and it went back. And then Allah begins to praise the intellect. وَعِزَّتِي وَجَلَالِي مَا خَلَقْتُ خَلْقًا هُوَ أَحَبُّ إِلَيَّ مِنْهُ. I did not create a creature, none of my creatures that I have created in this world, neither the heavens, nor the earth, the animals, nor the stars that we see that are so brilliant and so bright, are more beloved to me, this is Allah speaking, are more beloved to Allah than the intellect that Allah creates here. وَلَا أَكْمَلْتُكَ إِلَّا فِيمَا أُحِبُّ. And I do not complete you, I do not perfect you, the intellect, except for those and in those I love. And Allah, He says, according to another hadith, that it is through the intellect that Allah rewards human beings and He punishes them. Our means to Allah is through our intellect. Our means to Allah is through that fitrah that Allah has given us and has bestowed upon all human beings, that no human being can run away from that fitrah. Allah says, لا تبديل لخلق الله. There is no change in the creation of Allah, even though we might try. However much I might try to cover my conscience, and I might try to blind the people around me, Allah at some point is going to let His creation come to light. And so my conscience will call out when I see evil and oppression spreading in the earth. I'm going to ask the brothers one more time to just come forward a little bit so that we can make space for others who are entering. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Send another louder salawat. And yet, throughout our lives, a lot of times our intellect will tell us certain things. And our cultures will change that intellect, or they will let that intellect manifest in different ways. And in fact, one of the beauties and the blessings of Islam is that it allows the intellect to present and manifest itself based on the different cultures and the different societies that we live in. It does not shun or try to extinguish the different societies and the different cultures that we have. So for example, my intellect in my culture tells me that, for example, adab is very important, that I should respect my elders beyond anything else. That's the greatest priority that I have. Sometimes it might even come in the way of me doing my wajibat on time. Or, for example, one culture might tell me that this is how you should do azab for Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. And another culture tells me, no, this is a better way. One culture prioritizes crying, another culture prioritizes matam. One culture expresses their azab for Aba Abdullah al-Hussein as though it is the aza and the tragedy that a father feels towards his son. A mother feels towards her son. It makes it personal. One culture expresses it as a human relationship. That's Aba Abdullah al-Hussein when he let his son Ali al-Akbar go out into the battlefield and he sees Ali al-Akbar sacrifice himself, that this is the pain that a father feels towards his son. That is one culture. In another culture, we don't think about the human relationship, but we think about and we prioritize Aba Abdullah as an imam and a ma'soom, who is the perfect human being, who has the greatest love that a father could possibly have, that I could not even imagine for his son like Ali al-Akbar. And so it prioritizes the asma of Abu Abdullah. Different cultures, they express and they prioritize different things. And Allah allows for different cultures to express their intellect in different ways. And that is why we see this beautiful quilt, as they say, this beautiful tapestry that is Islam and that is the love for the Ahlulbayt. Different people express their love in many different ways, and they prioritize different things in that expression. In other words, their intellect reflects their love and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt in all of the different ways that make sense to them. And in fact, Islam tells us that this is something good and this is something beautiful. And we should learn from each other. We should not say that I am, for example, Arab and you are Iranian. I am Iranian and you are Pakistani. I am closer to those teachings and you are farther away. Rather, I should come together in these majalis, learning from the beautiful culture and cultures that I am surrounded by. Because, in other words, Allah reveals His religion and His revelation through the different intellects and the different fitrah that He places in different cultures. And in fact, this aql that prioritizes in different ways, that creates these different traditions and these different priorities, this is in fact one way that Allah reveals His religion. In another hadith from our Ahlul Bayt, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Imam says that there are two hujjas, two proofs that Allah has, that He has given to humankind. Those things that Allah is going to hold us to account. One is the hujjah zahira, the external hujjah, and the other is the hujjah batina, the internal hujjah. The external hujjah is the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And the internal hujjah is our aql, is our intellect. And so, according to the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, one of the ways that Allah reveals His religion to human beings is through their intellect. But, and this is trying to answer that question that we had, what is the relationship between the revelation that Allah presents through the Prophet and the revelation that He presents through my intellect and my heart? There are moments in my own life and in human history that I turn away from Allah's revelation that He gives to my mind and my soul. And there are moments when I cover that intellect, or I divert and I deform my intellect. And the path and the mission of the Prophet is to uncover those commands and that call of the intellect and of my fitrah. In a very beautiful khutbah in Nahj al-Balagha, Amir al-Mu'mineen Imam Ali says this. Sallu ala Muhammad wa I hope you all don't get tired by saying salawat. Because it helps you and it helps me wake up. So inshallah we can send another salawat. Amir al-Mu'mineen Imam Ali says, فَبَعَثَ فِيهِمْ رُسُلًا وَوَاتَرَ إِلَيْهِمْ أَنْبِيَاءَ. After he has described the state of the people of Arabia before the prophets of Allah came, they were in a state where they were unsure and uncertain about what to do. Their priorities were off. They thought that the greatest priority they had was in upholding their tribal allegiances. If I was a part of a strong tribe, then I would take pride in my tribe. And if I was not a part of any tribe, then you would be willing to attack me and take everything I had because I was weak, because I was alone. Tribalism and this sense of tribal allegiances and factions was the primary way that people would relate to each other. In this land that was neither in the east nor in the west, a people who were lost and didn't know what the priorities of their lives were, Allah sends His prophets. فَبَعَثَ فِيهِمْ رُسُلًا. He sends His prophets, various prophets that come. وَوَاتَرَ إِلَيْهِمْ أَنْبِيَاءَ. And He repeats this revelation to them, لِيَسْتَأْدُوهُمْ مِيثَاقَ فِطْرَتِهِ. So that He would call them to uphold the pact that He made with all human beings. That's fitrah, that's Allah created all human beings on. That's goodness and that's truth. وَيُذَكِّرُوهُمْ مَنْسِيَ نِعْمَتِهِ. And that human beings will be reminded by the prophets. That the prophets will remind them all of those blessings that they had forgotten. All of these things that Allah surrounds us with. Our families, our communities. And then all of a sudden we forget all of these blessings and we go and we create our own space. And we become individuals who don't want to do anything with those connections that we have. وَيَحْتَجُّ عَلَيْهِمْ بِالتَّبْلِيغِ. And then He would pronounce and He would call them to Allah. And then here is the final point. وَيُثِيرُ لَهُمْ دَفَائِنَ الْعُقُولِ. And He would uncover, the prophets, they would come and uncover those aspects of their intellects that they had buried deep down inside their souls. They had turned away so much within their lives from the call of Allah through their intellect, that now the prophets have to come and unbury and discover for them once more the very aql that Allah had bestowed upon human creatures. Now, how does the Prophet do this? How does the Prophet unveil for us our intellect? On the first hand, the Prophet, he tells us the very basic priorities and the very basic teachings that we all accept once we hear the Prophet's word. We're talking about the transition from the time of Jahiliyyah to the time of the Prophet of Allah. One of the most beautiful teachings that the Prophet had, even before he became a prophet, even before he got that message, that outward revelation, was what he remembers many years into his prophecy. It is said that once a man came into the city of Mecca, the city that the Prophet grew up in, and he did not have any tribal allegiance. He did not have a tribe who could protect him from the Quraysh and from the different people that he had business with. Comes into the city, and he is alone, and he wants to sell and he wants to trade. It is said that one person from a strong tribe, he goes and he makes this transaction with this person, and then he cheats that person out of his money. Says, for example, you sell me this, and I will give you this amount of money in return. When that person from that strong and powerful tribe, he gets the merchandise, he does not pay the person back. Says, well, this is the Wild West, in other words, and I am from a strong tribe, powerful. Power is the word of the day. I can do whatever I want. What are you going to do? What are you going to say? In such a state, in such a situation, in such a culture, it is said that this person, he throws up his hands and he has nothing to respond with. Says, if I do anything against you, your entire tribe is going to come and kill me. What would I do? And it is said that this person, he goes and he proclaims to the people of Quraysh and to the people of Mecca, these people who prided themselves on nobility. He says to them, this is what happened to me in your city. What are you all going to do? Are you going to let this injustice continue? It is said that a group of noble men, they come together and they say that it does not matter what tribe you are or what tribe I am, who comes into our city as a stranger and who does not have any support. If there is anyone who is oppressed in our city, then we will be the voice for that person who is oppressed. If there's any injustice that is done in our city, whether that person is from my tribe or he is not, then I and we as a collective will stand up for that person. And this becomes a very famous incident called Hilful Fudul, the pact of the virtuous and the righteous. And many years later, the Prophet of Allah, he says, if I take pride in that hilf, in that pact, that we made not during and after I received my revelation. This is all before Islam had come. And if once again that hilf, that pact, is recreated, then I, as a prophet of Allah, will take part in that act. I will be the voice of the oppressed and of those who are weak, the mustad'afin. When we hear this, what do we say? We say, well, this is a very noble thing. Again, our hearts and our aql and our fitrah say that the Prophet, in his goodness and in his compassion, he did something that is noble. And this was not because he was a prophet and he received the revelation, but because of his own intellect, because of his own fitrah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala. So the first lesson is that the Prophet, of course, he upholds and he gives importance to the very nature and that aql that Allah gives us. But that is not enough. The second way that the Prophet, he connects us back to Allah and he reveals to us our relationship and our means to reach Allah is because Allah has completed and has perfected his intellect over and beyond all of our intellects. Many times we do not know how to prioritize not just what is good versus what is bad, but even our own lives. I don't know whether I should spend more time at work or I should spend more time at home. I don't know how much time I should spend in the community center versus I should spend time with my own family. These are both good things. These are both important. But I just simply don't know how to prioritize my life. And so it is in the life and in the actions of the Prophet of Allah that I look to, and in the want and in the will of the Prophet of Allah that I look at to take lessons in terms of how I should prioritize and how Allah prioritizes. When I think about the decisions of the Prophet, I don't think about just the decisions of a single person, but a person who Allah has perfected their intellect so much that his will is Allah's will, and Allah's will is his will. I mentioned this hadith last night, that when we want to connect to Allah, we want to learn about our religion and our tradition, we don't just look at the Quran. The Quran tells us the very basic principles and priorities that Allah has set. But how to live and prioritize those principles, we look at the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa And brothers and sisters, this is one of the most important lessons that we get from the Ahlulbayt. Why? Because this goes against that very claim that once was said, Hasbuna Kitab Allah, that the book of Allah is enough for us. We might think that this is something that someone said many years ago. But a lot of times we find that this seeps into my own way of thinking. When we divorce ourselves from the teachings and the ahadith of the prophets and the Ahlulbayt, and we say that the ahadith, well, we don't know where they come from. I'm not sure, are these ahadith good or bad, they're right or they're wrong, or they're fabricated or they're not. And we just say that ahadith, we're going to put them to the side. That's really, in effect, what we're doing. And sometimes we say, well, what does the Quran say? Don't worry about the ahadith, what does the Quran say? Because the ahadith, who knows? You can't understand the very basic aspects of your religion without looking at the Prophet of Allah and the words and the teachings of the Ahlulbayt. The Quran says pray. And as I mentioned last night, Allah, He revealed a very particular type of prayer. The prayer that Allah revealed to the Prophet, taking Hasbuna Kitab Allah. The prayer that Allah revealed to the Prophet was how many prayers? 5. And each one of these prayers only had how many rak'ats? 2 rak'ats. But then now the Prophet decides. We say, the want of Allah is the want. The irada of Allah is the irada of the Prophet. And the irada of the Prophet is the irada of Allah. The Prophet decides that for Dhuhr and Asr, I'm going to add 2 more rak'at. And this is how I want to do prayer, and I want my ummah to do prayer. And for Maghrib, he adds a 3rd rak'at, and for Isha, he adds a 4th rak'at, 2 more rak'at. Not only can I not find this in the Quran, but I can't even find this in the revelation that God gave to the Prophet. This is the want and the will of the Prophet. And so if I turn away from the Prophet of Allah, I turn away from the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, I cannot know what Allah wants from me. Because the Prophet's intellect and his understanding has reached to such an extent, Allah has perfected it for him, to such an extent, that now I understand what Allah wants from me through the wants of Rasulullah. In the same hadith, the Imam says, the Quran and Allah, they prohibited wine. But now the Prophet, he comes and prohibits everything that is intoxicating for human beings. Anything that intoxicates us and takes away our intellect and takes away the very thing that God gave us as the greatest blessing that God gives to human beings, that is also haram. And many of the other ahkam that we have, these are not ahkam that God revealed to the prophets, but that the prophets decided is what the Muslims should do and what they should refrain from. So we want to understand the religion of Allah. We don't just look at the revelation and the Quran, but we stick to the Prophet and the Ahlulbayt. And then finally, brothers and sisters, we mentioned two ways that the Prophet guides us and is our means back onto Allah. The first, that the Prophet reinforces the very things that our intellect teaches us. Second, that the Prophet gives us the priorities that Allah wants, and through the will and the want of the Prophet, we discover the will and the want of Allah. Allah, who is transcendent, who does not change. He says, you want to know what I love? Look at what my Prophet loves. You want to know who I hate? Look at who my Prophet hates. That is how I deal with the world. And this is where, when we look in Ziyarat Ashura, becomes even more revealing to us. Silmun liman salamakum. I am in peace with those who have come into peace with you. I am at war for those who are at war with you. I am a wali of those who are your awliya, and I am an enemy of those who are an enemy of you. Because it is through the Ahlul Bayt that we know what Allah wants. And it is through who they love that we know who Allah loves. Through who they hate that we know who Allah hates. And then finally, brothers and sisters in Iman, it is through the practice and the life of Rasulullah that we understand not only how Allah wants us to prioritize our lives, but how we should prioritize our lives as well. It is said that Rasulullah once said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He says, Inna Jibra'il, al-Ruh al-Amin, nazala alayya min 'inda Rabbil Alameen. Once Jibra'il, he descended upon me from Allah, the creator of and the sustainer of the heavens. فَقَالَ يَا مُحَمَّدْ عَلَيْكَ بِحُسْنِ الْخُلْقِ. He says, O Muhammad, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And this is my final point, brothers and sisters, and then inshallah we will turn our hearts towards Karbala. Jibreel says to the Prophet, O Prophet, O Muhammad, عَلَيْكَ بِحُسْنِ الْخُلْقِ. It is your responsibility and your duty to have a beautiful character. فَإِنَّ سُوءَ الْخُلْقِ. This bad character, it will take away from you خَيْرَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. When we say khulq, it's not just an adab. Your culture teaches you one adab, my culture teaches me another adab. Adab, in other words, the way that we interact on a superficial level, our actions that we have towards each other. Khulq is different from adab. Khulq is how I am and who I am. I might be a person who respects my elders, but I only respect them superficially. When it's inconvenient for me, I turn my back. I'm a person who is kind and charitable when other people are looking on, but when the time comes that I have to be charitable, I turn my back and I say, I'm sorry, I don't have enough. Khulq, charity, is when I feel like I need to give to this brother or this sister of mine. This person who is asking me for some assistance, even though I don't have anything in my hand or in my pocket. I try to figure out a way how I can help them. Because my heart and my soul and my entire being is filled with charity, is filled with compassion. And so it becomes difficult for me to turn my back, even though I don't have anything to give. It is said that the Prophet of Allah, sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, whenever a person would come and ask him for some assistance, if he had, he would give. But if he didn't, he would make that person feel so loved and so honored that that person would not feel as though they have left with their hands empty, and with the Prophet having disrespected them, na'udhu billah. He would try to help them in whatever way he could. He couldn't help them, then he would ask his brother. If he couldn't help them, then he would ask someone else to assist this person. That is what husnul khuluq means. That I'm not just doing certain actions, and I'm not even just thinking certain things, but I have become a person who can't do anything but be charitable and give sadaqah and care about the creation of Allah and be just and be honorable. And so Rasulullah, he continues, Ala wa inna ashbahakum bi ahsanukum khuluqan. If you want to become like me, Ya ayyuhal muslimin, Ya ayyuhal muslimun, if you want to become like the Prophet of Allah, then have a beautiful character. Understand how to prioritize your life, but even beyond that, practice and get this habit of becoming like the Prophet. A person who had the most beautiful of characters, a person who, anyone who came to him, whether they believed in his mission or his message or not, they could not turn away from the Prophet without saying that his character was beautiful, that he was charitable and honorable. And this is the tragedy of the Muslims. When we come to Karbala, the Muslims had remembered what the Prophet had done for them. It was only 50 years or so. It's been 50 years. That's not even an entire generation that has passed. Many of the people who met Abu Abdullah or who were in the court of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad and who even were in the court of Yazid, they remembered the character of the Prophet of Allah. They remembered the blessing of the person of the Prophet of Allah. And even many of them remembered how their lives and their civilization and their societies had been changed and transformed by the Prophet of Allah. And so when it comes to the events of Karbala, one of the greatest tragedies is that those very people that the Prophet honored and the Prophet loved, and through the love of the Prophet, Allah Himself loved, these are the very same people that these enemies of Allah are now turning their backs upon, and even worse, they are fighting and slaughtering on the plains of Karbala. The Prophet says, Al-Hassan wal-Hussein Sayyida Shabab Ahl-Jannah. Hassan and Hussein are the masters of the youth of paradise. And it is this very Hassan and very Hussein that are being attacked and will be massacred on the plains of Karbala. Tonight, let us remember that memento and that reminder of Imam al-Hussein's brother, Qasim, that source of his consolation, that his brother as well was here with him and by his side. It is said that when Imam al-Hassan, he passes away, Imam al-Hussein takes Qasim under his wing. And he raises Qasim as his own child. Throughout the life of little Qasim, a boy of maybe 11, 12, the highest age that has been given to Qasim in our books of history is maybe 16 or 17 years old. Throughout this entire time that Qasim has lost his father, Imam al-Hassan, it is said that Qasim did not feel as though he was an orphan, because Abu Abdullah al-Hussein is standing over Qasim and is taking care of him, as though he is his own child and not his nephew, as though Qasim is from him and he is from Qasim. And so it is said that Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, on the night of Ashura, when he has spoken to all of his companions, and he tells his companions to take the hands of your family members and take the hands of my family and go out into the night. And all of the companions, they are surrounding Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, and they begin to stand up one after another, and they pledge allegiance to Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. Zuhair tells Abu Abdullah, "O Abu Abdullah, if I am given 1,000 lives and Allah brings me back to life after I have been killed in your path, for 1,000 times, then, O Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, I would give my life for you." And then another companion rises up, and he pledges his allegiance again. It is said that Abu Abdullah, he responds to them by saying, "O my companions, you are the best companions that I could have asked for." And he begins to recount for each one of them how they are going to be killed and slaughtered on the next day. And it is said that maybe in a majlis like this, where the people have surrounded Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, Qasim, this young man, is sitting in the corner. And he is waiting for his uncle, Imam al-Hussein, to as well say his own name. To as well say that Qasim, you as well will be killed. And it is said that when Qasim does not hear his name, he as well stands up and he asks his uncle, "Oh my uncle, will I also be shaheed on the morrow? Will I also give my life in your path, O Abu Abdullah al-Hussein?" Think about what Imam al-Hussein and how his heart is thinking about this conversation with Qasim. This young boy that is his only memory of Hassan, his brother. What is he going to say to this young nephew of his? It is said that Imam al-Hussein, he asks him, "How do you see death in your eyes, O my young son, O my young nephew Qasim?" He says, "Ahla min al-asad." I see death, if it is in your path, O my uncle, I see it as I see it as sweeter than honey. The sweetest thing that I could possibly imagine is giving my life for your path. And it is said that, having said this, Imam al-Hussein responds that, "O Qasim, you as well will be killed." And maybe Imam al-Hussein says, "Even though you are young, Qasim, but you are not going to be the youngest shaheed on the next day. But even Ali al-Asghar, that young infant of mine, is going to be killed on the next day." So Qasim, take pride in this shahada. And yet it is said that on the next day, Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, he has now sent out Ali al-Akbar, and he has brought the body of Ali al-Akbar back to the camp. And now Qasim comes to the front, and he is asking his uncle Abu Abdullah, "Oh my Imam, oh my uncle, will you give me permission to go out and to give my life in your path?" Imam al-Hussein says, "Oh my son Qasim," he would try to find one excuse or another to tell Qasim to go back to the camp. "Oh my young son Qasim, oh my young nephew, you are just a boy. How are you even going to fit on the horse? This armor does not even fit your young body. Oh Qasim, go back to the camp." And it is said that Qasim, he falls upon the feet of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein and he begins to kiss the feet of Imam al-Hussein. He says, "Oh my Imam, this is my only wish of you, that I give my life in your path. Oh my Imam, give me this honor and give me this blessing so that I can go out and fight." And it is with a very heavy heart that Imam al-Hussein, he lifts little Qasim and he presses him against his chest. It is said that Imam al-Hussein and Qasim, they embrace each other 2 times during the day of Ashura. Once is when Imam al-Hussein is saying his final farewell. And then Imam al-Hussein places the armor and the helmet upon the head of little Qasim. And this armor and this helmet does not fit properly. And so the Imam takes his imamah and he wraps it around the head. Imagine a young boy whose armor cannot fit him properly, and yet he has no choice but to go out into the battlefield. And Imam Hussein, he helps little Qasim upon the horse. And then little Qasim, he goes out into the battlefield. He says, "In tankuruni فأنا ابن الحسن سبت النبي المصطفى المؤتمن هذا حسين كالأسير المرتهن بين أناس لا سقوا صوب المزن." Little Qasim says, "If you do not know who I am the son of Hassan, the grandson of the Prophet of Allah. If you're not going to have mercy upon these companions, know who you are fighting with. You are fighting with Allah and His Prophet and the grandson of the Prophet." This is Hussein that you see. Qasim is not thinking about himself, but he points to his uncle Hussein. This is the Hussein that you see, who is like a prisoner in your midst, amongst the people who by Allah let them not see any goodness and any blessing showered upon them. And it is said that Qasim, even though he was a young boy, he fights a very valiant and brave fight, and he cuts down some of the enemy soldiers. But what can a young boy do? It is said that one man, Amr ibn Sa'd, a very vile and evil man, he looks at little Qasim and he says, "I am going to cut this boy down." And some of the enemy soldiers turn to this vile man and they say, "This is just a young man. What will you do to this young boy?" He says, "I am going to make this day dark for this young boy." And it is said that this man, he comes up from behind, brothers and sisters in Iman. He comes up from behind and he strikes Qasim upon his head. And Qasim now, he doesn't know which way to go. It is said that he falls upon the ground. Imam al-Hussein is watching from the camp. And Imam al-Hussein, he cannot do anything but to watch on as Qasim's body falls upon the ground. And Qasim now calls out, "Wa Amma, Wa Husseina." He calls out, "Oh my uncle, oh Hussein, I bid you my final farewell." And it is said that Imam al-Hussein comes upon the body of Qasim like a hawk, and he spreads open the enemy soldiers like a lion spreads open the enemies that he has. And it said that he comes upon the body of Qasim. But it is not before the body of Qasim is trampled under the feet of the horses. It is not before the enemy soldiers have struck the body of Qasim. There is not much life left in that young body. And it is said that Imam al-Hussein, he looks upon that body and he says, Ya Azza Allah, ala ammika, and it is so difficult upon your uncle that you call upon him. Wala yajibuk. And he cannot do anything, and he cannot respond to you. أو يجيبك ولا يعينك. And if he responds to you, he cannot assist you. Oh my son Qasim, this is the second time that the Imam holds Qasim in his arms, and he presses the body of Qasim upon his own body. And he says, I bid you farewell, oh my young son. I bid you farewell, oh my young nephew. Have patience, for your father is going to meet you in just a few moments. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ.